Hello, social ontologists. My name is Neil Van Leeuwen, and I'm a faculty member at Georgia State University. My talk is entitled Two Theoretical Roles for Belief. And just to give you a rough idea, it's about how two different theoretical roles are associated with the notion of belief, and very different mental state types play each different role. One role is what I would call mundane action guidance, and the other serves a role in group formation and group identity constitution. And the key point that I'm going to be driving at is the sorts of mental states that play each role are going to be very different. And so indiscriminate use of the term belief, which we see a lot of in philosophy, to be frank, and other cognitive sciences, is going to be very misleading. So let's jump right in. Here's my outline. First, I explain the two theoretical roles in a little bit more detail. Second, I pose both theoretically and empirically the question of whether we ought to regard the occupants of those two roles as the same mental states, and I argue the answer is no. And then I conclude with some general lessons about competence, performance, and norms. Competence in the formation of the states versus performance or bad performance in the formation of the states, and then what norms make sense for each state type. So a lot to get through, but it should be a fairly clear progression. Okay, let's start here. So Fred takes there to be a lion behind the bush. I say takes there to be neutral as to what mental state it is, but he takes there to be a lion behind the bush. Fred Prime also takes there to be a lion behind the bush. Fred is correct, Fred Prime is not correct. And we say Fred knows there to be a lion behind the bush, whereas Fred Prime errs in taking there to be a lion behind the bush. And what would be nice is that to have a word that doesn't obscure what those two mental states have in common. So we want to say that Fred believes there's a lion behind the bush. So the first theoretical role we're focusing on is the mundane one. X is what Fred and Fred Prime have in common that explains the action of running. So belief in this mundane sense is just what knowledge and error have in common and explains goal-oriented action generation. And just to have a labeling scheme, we'll say that Fred and Fred Prime have the same quote unquote belief with the content that there is a lion behind the bush. All right, we can expand on this. This is more or less the notion of belief that we see in contemporary philosophy of action. And belief is that which explains both what knowledge and error have in common, and then also explains action generation in characteristic Davidsonian fashion. Well, the word belief, I just wanted to point out one more thing. Cognitive scientists also use the word belief for this theoretical role, like when we see the false belief task or the Sally Ann task. Okay, so same sense is operative. Now, let's consider a different sort of thing that belief is used to explain, or a different theoretical role that mental states play that are labeled belief. So we have a bunch of people here represented by smiley faces, and they get into groups. They might not like each other. So the purples and the greens, they're opposed. Notice some people are on the fence, right, between purple and green. Some people are more loyal, less loyal, as indicated by proximity to the center of the circles or ellipse in one case. But in any case, we want to say something like their beliefs explain why the purples, or in virtue of what the purples, are all in one group. So the purples worship the purple god, the greens worship the green god of the mountain. And we want to say that why is that which explains why purples associate with other purples and greens associate with other greens. Of course, there are going to be many things like this, like shared rituals, shared habits, shared locations, and so on. But one of the things that explains group identity is going to be quote unquote belief. And this is going to be our second groupish theoretical role for belief. So belief is that that mental state which explains group associations in some way and to some extent. And we can precify that further. I do so in other work, but this should be good for now. So to have a labeling scheme, we'll say the purples have the same beliefs. The greens have the same beliefs. And this explains their group cohesion, which is relevant for present purposes because in social ontology, we're asking, well, what is it that makes a group, the sort of entity that it is? All right, and part of the answer is going to be beliefs. Now you might start scratching your head for a minute and say, well, wait a second, is the thing that played the first theoretical role the X such that it explains what knowledge and error have in common and is involved in Davidsonian action generation? Is that the sort of thing that also explains group cohesion? And we want to raise that as a legitimate question rather than presupposing that it will all be the same mental state type, just in virtue of the fact that we happen to call both things beliefs. So it may be an accident of linguistic history that we use the word belief for both kinds of mental states. And it is not a priori that the mental state that plays the X mundane role is the same as the mental state that plays the Y groupish role. And now what I want to go on to do is offer some theoretical reasons for denying that the mental state types are the same. And I'll gesture at a few empirical reasons. I dwell on that at much more length in other works, but right now we're trying to stay at a more abstract theoretical level. Well, let's go back to Fred taking there to be a lion behind the bush and Fred prime taking there to be a lion behind the bush. We want to ask ourselves, what properties should we expect the occupant of the X role to have as characteristics of a mental state type? Well, X's mundane role is to guide the agent to desire satisfaction, right? Well, it should therefore, and I think many philosophers of belief say this, it should be responsive to changes in the world and open to correction, right? Because if it weren't responsive to changes in the world, our desire satisfaction would be continually thwarted. To give another example, if you're having a belief with the content that cookies are in the cupboard and you desire cookies if you desire cookies, then that mental state had better be true and had better at least be able to update with changes in the world and become extinguished when you see contrary to evidence. Otherwise, you wouldn't find the cookies ever. If it were false, you would just keep going back and looking for the cookies and continually being frustrated. So in order to play this desire satisfaction guiding role, it should be the case that X, that which plays the mundane role, is vulnerable to evidence. And I define this in other works, but it basically means that contrary evidence is a major factor in the extinction conditions of those beliefs that play the mundane theoretical role. It should also be the case that it's not just under voluntary control, because it should track the world, right? Fred might not want there to be a lion behind the bush. I mean, he might not want to believe there's a lion behind the bush, but if that belief is going to help him accomplish his desire of staying away from lions, it had better not just be responsive to those kind of voluntary pressures on pain of death in this case, and so on. So evidentially vulnerable, and on the flip side, not under voluntary control, at least in not any kind of direct way. So those are things that are normally attributed to beliefs, and they help them, and there's a good reason for that, they help them play the roles that they need to play in our lives. Well, one more thing, X should also tend to have contents with determinate implications and are likely to be shared by suitably placed cognitive agents. I won't go into that and elaborate it further, but suffice it to say that if X is going to have this Davidsonian action guiding role, it better have a certain amount of clarity about what it implies about what the world is like. Otherwise, it wouldn't help us know what to do. And then, of course, in coordinating group behavior towards goals, it should be shareable by suitably placed cognitive agents. All right, well, let's go and ask ourselves, do the quote unquote beliefs, or whatever mental state it is, set the label aside, that plays the groupish role, are they going to have the same properties as these states that play the mundane theoretical role? Will they be evidentially vulnerable, and will they be involuntary? Well, recall that the greens share the belief, the quote unquote belief, that there's a green god on the mountain, and the purples share their beliefs. We say, well, what properties should these mental states have in order to play this groupish theoretical role? Well, the groupish role is to serve as a distinctive internal group identity marker and as a marker of loyalty to the group, maybe for the purposes of generating costly signaling through sacrifices and so on and so forth. And when I say an internal group identity marker, what I want to say there is that it's a representational state that generates outward behaviors that signal group identity. Well, it seems to follow from that this mental state should not be so responsive to evidence or changes in the world or to correction. And why is that? Well, if I have the belief that there's a green god on the mountain, and if this is constitutive of my group identity and a marker of my loyalty, it would be very bad if this belief were to be extinguished by something so trifling as mere contrary evidence, right? If this is going to be something that cements my loyalty to the group, it would be quite bad if it were vulnerable to evidence in the way that the mundane beliefs are. And also, we can note that if its main function is to generate symbolic signaling, it doesn't matter so much for its purpose, and maybe it's even contrary to its purpose, that it should be true, right? Because if it were objectively true and shareable that there's a green god on the mountain and verifiable by checking the evidence, why then it wouldn't be distinctive of us as a group, because everyone would think that. So no one is going to form a group around the belief that grass is green, because everyone thinks that, and that belief would no longer be distinctive. So being invulnerable to evidence is actually a feature, not a bug, if you think about it, when it comes to this groupish theoretical role. So let's continue a little bit more. We conclude that this type of mental state should not be evidentially vulnerable. And in some respect, it should be voluntary as well. One, because you make a certain choice to belong to the group, and you're continually choosing to continue to belong to the group. And then if it's voluntary, the group members can hold you accountable if you're maintaining your mental state properly and continuing to have your beliefs as indicated typically by the practices. So maybe the group doesn't focus on the beliefs so much, but they focus on the outwards expression of them, which are indicators of the internal belief, which is sort of like a badged mental state, is one way of putting it. Okay, so another thing we would want to say about the groupish theoretical role type mental states is that they should have idiosyncratic contents that are harder to share, because that makes them more distinctive of the group that we happen to be in. All right, so now we're starting to see some real strong theoretical reasons, I think, for denying that mundane beliefs, those that play the X role or the mundane theoretical role, and groupish beliefs are the same sort of mental state. Mundane beliefs should tend to be evidentially vulnerable, groupish beliefs not. Contrary-wise, mundane beliefs should not be voluntary, while groupish beliefs should be. And the shareability of the contents are also going to differ. One more thing that I often point out in other work is that mundane beliefs guide behavior invariant to social setting or to practical setting or situation. And here I'm taking off the work of Michael Bratman. He has a great article about acceptance in a context, from 1992, beliefs are not practical setting dependent, how I put it, whereas groupish beliefs are often compartmentalized to social settings or to social signaling situations, and they're left to the side often when it's not a ritual situation or not time to signal your group loyalty. They don't guide behavior in those situations. So we're left, despite the commonality of the word belief, looking at mental states with very different sets of functional properties. And just to generate, not to generate, but to refer to a few pieces of evidence for the latter point. There are studies that show things like in the Bible Belt, where people have the groupish belief that God is watching, God is present. There's lower rates of porn subscription on Sundays, but somewhat higher rates during the rest of the week. And then, so that shows the compartmentalization of the groupish belief. And then in the Fez Medina, and this is a study by Eric Duhem from 2015, in the Fez Medina, where people, why believe that Allah requires charity, there's higher giving rates during the 20-minute period after the call to prayer when it comes to charity. So those are just a couple little snippets, or I should say just the tip of the iceberg of the evidence that suggests that groupish belief states are much more compartmentalized than the mundane belief states, which can't be compartmentalized on pain of getting eaten by a lion, missing out on cookies, or just falling in a ditch. So one more piece of evidence from Cheryl Townsend Gilkey's is that members of charismatic churches no longer shout and get happy when the service is over, as she puts it. And that seems to suggest that as much as they, quote unquote, believed groupishly that they were overtaken by the Spirit and had lost control of themselves, they were, as she puts it, perfectly composed the minute the service was over. And again, that's just another small indicator of compartmentalization. I'll be the first to admit that one would want to see much, much more evidence than that. And that's evidence to be assembled, but that's just a small taste of for you of the empirical side of this argument. All right, Evans Pritchard's, the anthropologist, says that 9/10 of the time in pre-industrial societies, people spend their efforts on mundane humdrum activities, as he puts it, and they're not acting on their supernatural beliefs. Okay, so carrying on, are the mental states that play the groupish and the mundane theoretical role the same? I say, no, they're not. All right, so what are two takes on this difference? So some people might just want to say, okay, the reason the groupish beliefs aren't responding to evidence, it's just performance failure. All right, it's just people being misled by motivational states, or people having the cognitive errors, or not reasoning well, or something like that. So the evidentially unresponsive properties or the failures of inference that people exhibit as part of their groupish beliefs, those are just performance errors. And this is something that a lot of people think, but this is sort of what Neil Levy has suggested in a 2017 paper that criticizes some of my work. But what I want to suggest is that compartmentalization and unresponsiveness to evidence are sort of a distinct competence for groupish beliefs, right? And that's competence in the very Chomskyan sense. So these properties help distinguish members of one group from another. And so it's almost to be expected that groupish beliefs are going to exhibit these properties. And that's, as unfortunate as we may find them, that's them doing their job, not just failures of reasoning, but successful performance of another role. And as much as I don't like the fact that humans may be like it seems to be a fact that humans are like this, and we had better be honest about it. So you can't correct groupish belief just by correcting errors in reasoning.